The night was quiet in the city. Streetlights glowed faintly, and the cool air carried the sound of cars passing by. Officer Miller sat in his police cruiser, parked near the edge of a neighborhood he often patrolled. He was not known for kindness, and his reputation carried a mix of arrogance and prejudice. Miller often believed he could tell who belonged in an area and who did not, just by looking. As he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, a sleek black car drove past. The vehicle moved smoothly, without speeding, without breaking any rule. But something about it made Miller narrow his eyes. The car was polished, the kind of car someone with money would drive. Behind the wheel was a well-dressed black man. His suit was sharp, his hands steady on the wheel. He looked calm, focused, and very much in control. But to Miller, the sight stirred an old bias he carried deep inside. He frowned. What's he doing here? He thought. In his mind, this man didn't fit the picture of the neighborhood. Instead of asking himself if he was being unfair, Miller instantly assumed trouble. Without a second thought, he turned on his flashing lights and pulled out behind the car. The black car slowed to the side of the road, smooth and careful. The driver followed every rule. He parked neatly, turned off his engine, and waited. There was no panic in his movements, no sign of guilt. He was calm, as though he had been through situations like this before. Officer Miller got out of his cruiser, his boots striking the pavement hard. He adjusted his belt and straightened his cap, trying to look bigger, more intimidating. As he walked toward the driver's window, his chest was filled with a strange confidence. To him, this was just another stop, another chance to remind someone of his authority. The man in the car rolled down the window slowly. His expression was calm, his dark eyes steady. His voice was deep and polite when he spoke. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Miller didn't like the tone. It wasn't fearful. It wasn't shaky. It was controlled, confident. That irritated him more than anything else. "License and registration," Miller demanded sharply, ignoring the question. The man handed them over without a word. His hands didn't tremble. His breathing didn't change. Miller studied the license but barely glanced at the name. He was too focused on the man's skin, the car he drove, and the irritation boiling in his chest. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. The man met his gaze unshaken. "I was driving home. I didn't realize that was a crime." The words were calm, but they carried weight. The crowd on the sidewalk had not gathered yet, but a couple walking their dog slowed down, watching the flashing lights curiously. Miller's pride prickled. He didn't like being spoken to in a way that made him feel challenged. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Answer the question properly." "I did answer it," the man replied evenly. "I live here. I'm heading home." The officer shifted his stance. His hand hovered near his holster, not because there was any threat, but because he wanted to feel in control. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even raise his voice. His calmness only made Miller's frustration grow. Inside, the officer's thoughts raced. Why isn't he nervous? Why isn't he afraid? Every stop Miller had made before usually ended with people apologizing, stuttering, or showing fear. But this man was different. He wasn't angry, wasn't disrespectful. He was steady, and that steadiness made Miller uncomfortable. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Miller muttered. He leaned closer to the window. "Men like you always think they can get away with things." "Not tonight." The man raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained calm. "I believe I've broken no law. You stopped me without cause. And I'd advise you to think carefully about what you do next." The words hung in the air like a warning. Not loud, not aggressive, simply firm. Miller smirked, taking it as arrogance. "Oh, is that right? You're advising me now?" he said mockingly. The man simply folded his hands together, resting them on the steering wheel. His silence spoke louder than anything else. At that moment, the dog-walking couple whispered to each other, lingering on the sidewalk. Their eyes stayed on the scene, sensing tension. The neighborhood was quiet, yet the energy around the car was heavy. Something important was brewing, though none of them knew what. Miller cleared his throat, trying to shake off the odd feeling growing in his chest. He didn't know why the man's gaze unsettled him, why his voice carried such authority. He told himself it didn't matter. To him, this was just another traffic stop. But deep down, he felt something wasn't ordinary. The calm, confident driver had already planted the first seed of doubt inside him. The silence between the two men stretched longer than most traffic stops. The flashing red and blue lights kept painting the street, reflecting off the polished black car. Officer Miller stood stiff, staring at the driver, his jaw clenched. Something about this man made him uneasy, but Miller's pride refused to admit it. The driver, Marcus Johnson, kept his hands calmly on the steering wheel. His eyes never broke contact, and his voice was steady as he finally said, "You have my license, officer. What else do you need from me?" That calm tone, it wasn't fear, it wasn't nervousness. It was the kind of voice Miller usually heard from his superiors, not from a man he had just stopped. The difference stung his ego. Miller wanted to feel bigger, stronger, and in control. Instead, he felt as though the man in the car was controlling the pace of everything. "You don't ask me questions," Miller snapped, raising his voice. "I asked the questions, got it?" Marcus didn't respond. He simply nodded slightly as if Miller's bark meant nothing. That only made the officer's chest burn hotter. "What were you doing in that neighborhood back there?" Miller demanded again. "You think you can just drive around wherever you want without looking suspicious?" Marcus let out a small breath, shaking his head slightly. "Suspicious? For driving my own car home? That's not suspicious, officer. That's called living." The words were polite, but they cut deep. Miller felt his pride slipping away, like sand through his fingers. He leaned closer to the window, trying to tower over the man in the car. "Don't play smart with me," Miller growled. "Men like you. I know your type. Flashy car, expensive suit, acting like you own the street. You think you're above the law?" Marcus's expression stayed calm, but his eyes grew sharper, colder. "No," he said quietly. "I believe in the law more than you realize. The real question is, do you?" Those words hit like a hidden punch. Miller's throat went dry, but his anger forced him forward. He slammed the roof of the car with his palm, making a loud thump. The couple with the dog across the street gasped. Another pedestrian slowed down, pulling out a phone and pointing it at the flashing lights. Miller noticed the phone but pretended not to care. Inside, though, he hated the idea of being recorded. His voice dropped lower, but it was full of venom. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Marcus didn't move right away. He tilted his head, studying the officer, as though measuring his character. Then slowly he spoke. "On what grounds, officer?" "I've broken no traffic law. You stopped me without cause. And now you're escalating without reason." Miller's face tightened. He wanted to yell, to threaten, but the man's calmness made every threat sound weak before it left his mouth. "You think you can lecture me on the law?" Miller barked. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." For the first time, Marcus let out the faintest smile, though it carried no warmth. It was the kind of smile that said, "You have no idea what you're doing. Maybe you're the one who doesn't know who he's dealing with." Marcus replied. His tone was soft, but it had weight like a stone sinking into deep water. Miller's fists clenched. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he had already judged in his mind. His pride screamed for control, but his instincts whispered that something about this man was different. Dangerously different. The people on the sidewalk were now 5, maybe 6. Phones were recording. A teenager whispered to his friend, "That guy in the car looks way too calm. He doesn't seem scared at all." The crowd's murmurs only fueled Miller's anger. He wanted to prove his authority, to make this man bend. He raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll arrest you for resisting a lawful order." Marcus finally turned his head away, staring at the street ahead. He took a long breath as though giving the officer one last chance to correct himself. Then he said quietly, almost like a teacher correcting a student, "Careful, officer. You're walking into a mistake that you can't walk back from." The warning wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. But the way Marcus spoke made the words feel heavier than sirens or handcuffs. The people recording went silent for a moment, sensing something unusual. Miller's heart thumped in his chest. He wanted to brush it off as arrogance, but something inside him trembled. He couldn't explain it. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step into a fall he couldn't stop. But his pride wouldn't let him step back. He laughed bitterly, though his laugh sounded forced. "Oh, really? And what mistake is that? You think you can scare me with fancy words?" Marcus turned back to him slowly, his gaze like steel. His calmness had turned into authority, quiet but undeniable. "No," he said. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to warn you. Because if you keep going, the world won't see me as the one at fault, it'll see you. World won't see me as the one at fault, it'll see you. Miller opened his mouth to reply, but the sound of multiple phones recording clicked into his ears. For the first time, he realized every word, every movement was being captured. He wasn't just facing a man in a car. He was facing a mirror of his own actions. And that mirror was about to reflect everything ugly inside him. The flashing lights kept spinning. The crowd kept watching. And the officer's hostility had just pushed him closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. The street was no longer empty. What began as a quiet traffic stop had now become a silent performance watched by strangers. The flashing lights painted the night in red and blue, and the tension in the air was heavy enough that even people blocks away slowed their steps. Curious about what was happening, Marcus Johnson remained inside his car, calm as stone, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't move too much, didn't raise his voice, didn't act nervous. That calmness was unusual for anyone being stopped by a hostile officer, and it pulled more eyes toward him. People expected fear. Instead, they saw control. Officer Miller, on the other hand, looked like a storm ready to break. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, his words sharp. He kept raising his voice, trying to sound powerful. But the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he wasn't in control of the situation. It was the man in the car, the calm, composed driver who seemed to command the scene without saying much at all. Out of the car. Miller shouted again, pointing toward the sidewalk. You're resisting a lawful order. Don't make me drag you out. Marcus tilted his head slightly as though listening to a child's tantrum. His voice came out smooth, low and steady. Officer, you've been recording your own behavior since the moment you switched on those lights. Look around you. Everyone else is recording too. Are you certain you want to continue this path? Miller's chest tightened. He glanced around quickly and saw at least 6 people holding up their phones. Their faces glowed under the blue light of the screens, capturing every word, every twitch of his hand, every angry movement. He hated it. He wanted to shout at them to go away, but he knew he couldn't. Not with cameras rolling. A teenager with a hoodie whispered to the woman next to him, "That guy in the car is something else. He's not scared. He's like, waiting for something." The woman nodded. "Yeah, he doesn't look guilty. He looks like he knows more than he's saying." Miller heard their whispers, and it only fueled the fire inside him. He didn't like the idea of looking weak in front of a crowd. He especially didn't like the idea of a black man in a nice car making him look foolish. Pride and prejudice pushed him forward, even while his gut told him he was making a mistake. He leaned down to Marcus's window again, lowering his voice so only the man could hear. "Listen here," he hissed. "I don't care who's watching. If you think you can play games with me, you'll regret it. I'll find a reason to take you in. Trust me on that." Marcus finally shifted in his seat, turning his full gaze on the officer. His eyes were calm, but there was something sharp in them now. "No, officer," he said softly. "The only one who will regret this is you. Because once the truth comes out, no badge will protect you from your own actions." The words slid under Miller's skin like ice. He pulled back, his face tight with anger. He wanted to argue, but his throat closed around the words. For the first time, a small knot of fear began forming in his stomach. The crowd grew larger. A man with a bicycle leaned it against a pole and started recording. A woman walking her child stopped to watch. The tension of the scene was pulling people in like moths to a flame. They could all sense something unusual, something bigger than a simple traffic stop. "Sir, maybe you should just let him go," a man from the crowd called out carefully. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Miller snapped his head toward the voice. "Mind your own business," he barked. The man held up his phone higher. "It is my business if I see an officer abusing his power." More murmurs spread through the small crowd. Miller felt his pride cracking under the weight of so many eyes. He turned back toward Marcus, pointing a finger at him. "Step out of this car now, or I swear." But before he could finish, Marcus spoke again, louder this time so that everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to keep recording. What you are seeing is the danger of unchecked authority. A man in uniform judging me by my skin, not my actions. A man who forgot his oath." The crowd fell silent for a moment. The calm strength in Marcus's voice felt heavier than the officer's angry shouts. People's faces changed. Some looked shocked, some nodded in agreement, and some whispered that this wasn't a normal driver. Miller's heart pounded. He realized too late that he had lost the narrative. He was no longer the one controlling the story. Marcus had turned the crowd into witnesses, not just of a stop, but of injustice. Desperate, Miller reached for his radio. His hand trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I need backup at—" But Marcus interrupted again, his tone like steel. "Be careful with that call, officer, because backup will not save you from the truth that's already been recorded here tonight." The crowd buzzed. Phone stayed lifted. Miller froze with the radio in his hand, sweat forming at his temple. The authority he thought he owned was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a gnawing realization. The man he had stopped wasn't ordinary, and deep down, Miller's instinct screamed that the truth was about to crash over him like a wave he could not escape. The red and blue lights still flashed across the pavement, washing the faces of the small crowd now gathered on the sidewalk. Some whispered, others stood silent, but all of them had their phones raised. Every second of the traffic stop was being captured. The hum of the police cruiser mixed with the low murmur of voices, creating an atmosphere of tension so thick that even the night air felt heavy. Marcus Johnson remained seated inside the black car, hands calmly resting on the steering wheel. His posture was controlled, like a man who knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. His calm eyes kept following Officer Miller, who paced beside the car, restless and irritated. Miller was sweating now, though the night was cool. He had been a police officer for years, and he had handled everything from speeding teenagers to bar fights. But this was different. The man in the car didn't behave like the others. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't nervous, and most of all, he wasn't intimidated. That calmness felt dangerous to Miller. "Step out of the car," Miller barked again, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus turned his head slowly, locking his gaze on the officer. His voice was soft but sharp, cutting through the noise around them. "Officer, I will tell you this one last time. Reconsider your actions. You are walking into something you cannot undo." The crowd stirred. A man in the back whispered to his friend, "Did you hear that? He doesn't sound like a normal driver. It's like he's warning him." Miller's pride bristled. He clenched his fists at his sides, trying to look strong, but his gut twisted with unease. "Oh yeah?" he sneered, forcing a laugh. "And what exactly am I walking into? You think you can scare me with riddles?" Marcus leaned slightly forward, the streetlight reflecting off his suit. "Not riddles, officer, reality. When the truth arrives, it doesn't knock first, it breaks the door down. And right now you're standing in front of that door." The words hit harder than Miller expected. For a brief moment he felt like he was the one on trial, not the man in the car. He quickly shook off the thought, straightening his shoulders. "Save your speeches," Miller snapped. "You think talking big is going to get you out of this? You're making it worse for yourself." But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't argue or raise his voice. Instead, he let silence speak for him. That silence was louder than any shouting could be, and it forced Miller to fill the air with more of his own anger. "Don't you see?" Marcus finally said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the crowd to hear. "This is not about the law. This is about your pride. You stopped me because of what you assumed about me. Not what I did." A woman in the crowd called out, "He's right. He didn't do anything wrong." Her voice gave others courage, and soon murmurs of agreement spread through the people. Miller's chest burned with humiliation. He hated being questioned, especially in front of strangers. He stepped closer to the car window, lowering his voice to a growl. "You think you're clever? You think you can turn the crowd against me? But when backup gets here, you'll be the one in handcuffs." Marcus tilted his head, and for the first time that night he smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement, it was a smile of certainty, like a man who knew something the officer didn't. "Call whoever you want," Marcus said calmly. "But remember this moment, officer. Remember my warning, because once my identity is known, the crowd won't see me as a man resisting arrest. They'll see you as a man abusing power." The words crawled into Miller's mind and refused to leave. Identity, what did he mean by that? Miller felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He forced a laugh, but it sounded shaky. "Your identity? Who do you think you are, some big shot?" Marcus's eyes hardened, and for the first time his voice sharpened into something commanding. "Bigger than you realize. And when you hear my name, officer, the only thing you'll regret is not listening to me sooner." The crowd went silent, as though holding its breath. Phones stayed lifted, their tiny red recording dots glowing in the dark. Everyone sensed it. The story was reaching a breaking point. Miller's hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them to hide it. He told himself he was still in control. He told himself the man in the car was bluffing. But deep down, a part of him knew better. He stepped back, staring at Marcus with narrowed eyes. "We'll see about that," Miller muttered. "We'll see just who you really are." And with that, Miller turned toward his cruiser, gripping the license and registration tighter than before. His pride told him he would expose the man as nothing, but his gut whispered the opposite, that the moment he ran that name, his world would tilt in ways he wasn't ready for. The warning had been spoken. The choice was his. And now everyone waited to see what truth would come crashing down. The night felt colder now, though no one had moved. The red and blue lights flickered like restless shadows against the walls of the buildings. A crowd of almost a dozen stood on the sidewalk, phones raised like glowing lanterns. Their whispers mixed with the hum of the police cruiser, creating an uneasy background for what was about to unfold. Officer Miller marched back to his cruiser with stiff steps. His fists were clenched and his jaw locked tight. The man in the car, Marcus Johnson, still sat calmly, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady. That calmness gnawed at Miller's pride. It was as if the driver already knew how this story would end. Sliding into the driver's seat of his cruiser, Miller slammed the door harder than necessary. He grabbed the radio and punched in the driver's license details with quick, angry fingers. The radio crackled with static before dispatch answered. "Dispatch here, go ahead." "Yeah, run a check on this ID," Miller said, reading out the information. His voice was sharp, irritated, as if daring the system to prove him right. "Name Marcus Johnson." There was a pause on the other end, longer than usual. The silence wasn't normal. Miller frowned. "Dispatch?" he barked. The operator's voice returned, but it was different. Measured, respectful, almost cautious. "Officer Miller." "Confirm the name again." Miller repeated it, slower this time. "Marcus Johnson." Another pause. Then the voice came back, firmer now. "Officer Miller, are you aware of who you've stopped?" Miller blinked. The question didn't make sense. "What do you mean, who I've stopped? He's just another driver in the wrong neighborhood?" "No, officer." The dispatcher cut in quickly, her voice tight with urgency. "Marcus Johnson is not just another driver. He is the head of internal affairs, the special division." The words struck Miller like a sudden blow to the chest. He froze in his seat, the radio still pressed to his mouth. For a moment, he didn't breathe. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Head of internal affairs? The very man who investigated police misconduct? The man who had the power to review every complaint, every abuse, every officer's file? "You must be mistaken," Miller stammered, his voice suddenly weak. But dispatch's reply was final, with no room for doubt. "No mistake. That's him. You're to stand down immediately and cooperate. Do you copy?" Miller's face turned pale. His throat felt dry, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. He lowered the radio slowly, staring through the windshield at the calm figure still seated in the car. Marcus hadn't moved. He simply waited, as though he knew this moment was coming. Outside, the crowd continued recording, unaware of what had just been said over the radio. But Miller's body language gave away the truth. His swagger was gone. His shoulders sagged slightly, his face strained with the weight of realization. He opened the door and stepped out, his boots suddenly heavier on the pavement. The night air hit his face, but it didn't cool the burning heat of shame crawling up his neck. Marcus turned his head toward him, eyes steady, calm as ever. "Now you understand," he said softly, though only Miller could hear. The officer swallowed hard, but his throat stayed dry. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to say he hadn't known. But the words refused to come. Instead, he stood frozen, his hands twitching at his sides. From the crowd, a teenager called out, "What's going on?" "Why is he just standing there?" Another voice chimed in. "The driver hasn't even moved." "Why does the officer look like he's seen a ghost?" The murmurs grew louder, fueling Miller's humiliation. He knew every second was being recorded, and soon, the truth would spread far beyond this street. The man he had stopped, mocked, and threatened was his worst nightmare. The person who could dismantle his entire career with a single report. "You judged me before you even spoke to me," Marcus said, his tone sharper now. "You looked at my skin, my car, and you made a choice. That choice has consequences, officer." Miller's lips trembled. He whispered, almost pleading, I didn't know." Marcus's gaze didn't soften. "But you should have known. You swore an oath to treat every citizen with respect regardless of who they are, yet you broke that oath before I even rolled down my window." The crowd sensed the shift. Though they couldn't hear every word, they saw Marcus's confidence and Miller's crumbling posture. Phones zoomed in, capturing the contrast between the calm driver and the nervous officer. Miller wanted to order the crowd to leave, to stop recording, but he couldn't. Not now, not after the truth had been spoken into his radio. "Remember this moment," Marcus said, his voice carrying further now, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "because the badge on your chest doesn't shield you from accountability. It demands it." The words echoed in the night, cutting deeper than any threat. Miller stood frozen, sweat dripping down his temple. The crowd whispered louder, phones recording closer. He realized he was no longer in control of the stop. He wasn't even in control of his own dignity. For the first time in years, Officer Miller felt fear, not of the man in the car, but of the truth that had just been revealed. And Marcus, calm as ever, hadn't even needed to raise his voice. The street had changed. What began as a simple stop was no longer just about one officer and one driver. It had turned into a stage, and everyone watching felt the weight of what was happening. The red and blue lights kept flickering across faces, and the crowd had grown to nearly 20 people. Phones were raised high, capturing every second. But it wasn't just the crowd that had changed. Officer Miller had changed too. Only minutes ago, his chest was puffed with pride, his voice filled with arrogance. Now his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of reality. His face was pale, his jaw trembling. He could barely look at the man he had stopped, Marcus Johnson, head of internal affairs. Marcus still sat inside the black car, calm as ever, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than Miller's shouts had been earlier. The crowd began whispering, curious and suspicious. "Why does the officer look so nervous now?" a teenager asked, zooming his phone camera closer. "Maybe the driver's someone important," a woman suggested. "You can tell," said another man. "Look at the way he's sitting. He's not scared. He's waiting." Miller heard them. Every word stung like a blade. He wanted to silence them, to tell them to mind their business. But he couldn't, not now. The truth was out. Dispatch had confirmed it. The man he tried to humiliate was not just a citizen. He was the one who held the power to end Miller's career with a single report. "Officer," Marcus finally spoke, his calm voice carrying through the tense air, "this moment is bigger than just you and me. Everyone here is a witness, not to a crime I committed, but to the choices you made." The crowd grew silent, listening. Miller swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to answer, but every word felt dangerous. "You judged me the moment you saw my skin," Marcus continued. "You assumed guilt before you asked a question. And now, when the truth has been revealed, your pride is the only thing left standing between you and accountability." The crowd murmured in agreement. A man holding his phone high shouted, "He's right! We saw it all." Miller's hands shook. He tightened his grip on his belt, trying to hide the tremor. His pride screamed at him to fight back, but fear gripped his chest. He had been exposed, not just to this crowd, but soon to the whole city. Every video here would spread. Every word would be heard. For the first time, Officer Miller felt powerless. Marcus slowly opened his door. The crowd gasped, expecting the officer to react, but Miller didn't move. He froze, unsure of what to do. Marcus stepped out of the car with steady movements, his tall frame commanding presence under the streetlights. His suit caught the glow of the flashing lights, his polished shoes crunching softly against the pavement. He didn't need to act aggressive. His calmness was more powerful than any raised fist. He turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice strong but steady, "this is why truth matters. This is why accountability exists. Because no one, not even those with badges, should be free from the law." The crowd erupted with shouts of agreement. Some clapped, some cheered, and others simply nodded, their phones still recording every moment. Miller felt smaller and smaller. His legs trembled beneath him. He wanted to disappear, to walk away, but he knew it was too late. He couldn't erase what had been done. He couldn't erase the humiliation now painted across the faces of every witness. "Do you understand what this means, officer?" Marcus asked, turning his eyes back to him. Miller's voice cracked as he tried to respond. I didn't know who you were." Marcus shook his head. "That's not an excuse. Respect should not be based on titles or positions. It should be given to every person, no matter their skin, no matter their car, no matter their clothes. That's the law you swore to uphold. The words dug deep into Miller's heart. He felt as though the badge on his chest had suddenly turned heavy, pulling him down like a stone. The crowd grew bolder. Someone yelled, "You're finished, officer!" Another added, "We've got it all on video." Miller's lips trembled. He wanted to shout back, to demand silence, but he couldn't. His voice had lost its strength. Marcus's eyes locked on him again, sharp and unyielding. "Tonight, officer, you've shown who you are. And so have I. The difference is, I don't hide behind a badge. I honor it." The crowd roared with approval, the sound echoing through the street. Phones lifted higher, capturing the officer's shame and the driver's dignity. Miller stood frozen, his body numb. He had stopped a man he thought was beneath him, only to discover he was face to face with the very authority that oversaw his actions. His arrogance had collapsed into fear, and his fear into silence. The shock had spread beyond him now. It lived in the crowd, in the recordings, and soon it would live across the entire city. And Marcus Johnson, calm and unshaken, had become the symbol of a truth Miller could never escape. The silence after Marcus's words was heavy, like a curtain drawn over the street. For a moment no one moved. The flashing red and blue lights still spun, but the power behind them had faded. They no longer represented control. They represented exposure. Marcus stood tall beside his car, his eyes steady on Officer Miller. The officer's shoulders had collapsed inward, his chin lowered as if the badge on his chest had suddenly become too heavy. Sweat trickled down his temple, glistening under the harsh glow of the streetlight. The crowd shifted, murmuring louder now. Their phones stayed raised, their faces alert. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It had turned into something larger, something that would echo far beyond this night. Marcus turned toward the crowd first, his voice calm but strong, carrying across the street. "Do you see what happened here tonight?" he asked, his tone more like a teacher than a man in conflict. This was not about broken laws. This was about broken judgment. An officer of the law, sworn to serve and protect, chose instead to judge a man by his skin before he judged him by his actions. Miller flinched, but Marcus did not stop. This is why trust between communities and the police breaks. This is why fear exists, because some in uniform forget their oath, and they let pride and prejudice guide their choices. But let me remind you all, truth has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, no badge, no authority, no silence can hide it. The crowd erupted in applause, clapping and shouting, some cheering his name though they had just learned it. The sound rolled through the street like a wave, and for the first time that night Marcus raised his voice above it, his tone commanding. Accountability does not begin with titles. Accountability begins with respect. Respect for every person, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like. Because the law is not a weapon, it is a shield. And tonight that shield was broken by pride. Phones zoomed closer. The moment was being captured from every angle. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from the crowd to Marcus, his pride bleeding into humiliation. Marcus turned back to face him directly. His voice lowered, but it cut sharper than before. "Officer Miller, do you understand now? Respect should never be conditional. It should never depend on race, wealth, or neighborhood. You forgot that tonight." Miller's lips parted, but no sound came. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His hands twitched at his sides, wanting to defend himself, to explain, to deny. But every excuse he thought of collapsed before it even reached his tongue. Marcus stepped closer, his calm presence pressing heavier than any shout could. "What you did tonight is not just about me. It's about every man and woman you've stopped before me, every person you judged before speaking, every moment you let your pride take control. Those moments do not vanish. They build. And tonight they stand here as witnesses against you." The officer looked down, his face red with shame. Marcus's tone softened, but it carried a final weight. "But tonight is also an opportunity. Not for me, for you. Because the first step toward change is to face the truth. And the truth is that you let your badge become a mask for your prejudice. You can choose now whether you will keep hiding behind that mask or whether you will finally live by the oath you swore." The crowd hushed, leaning in, waiting for Miller to respond. But he stayed frozen, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. "Look at him," a man in the crowd muttered. "He can't even answer." Another whispered, "The driver's right. He's teaching him a lesson." Marcus raised his voice again, turning toward the crowd one last time. "Remember this night. Remember what you witnessed. Because this is not just about one officer or one man. This is about the power of truth. And truth once revealed can never be silenced. Applause broke out again, louder this time. Some cheered Marcus's name. Others shouted words of support. The air was charged, alive with the energy of justice unfolding right before their eyes. Miller stood as still as a statue, his pride shattered. Every shout, every clap, every recording cut deeper into him. He realized he was no longer feared. He was no longer respected. He was exposed. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about the message. The lesson had been delivered not just to Miller, but to everyone who would watch this moment later. And as Marcus stepped back toward his car, the crowd's applause following him, the weight of the truth hung in the air like a verdict already passed. The night that began with flashing lights ended with something far brighter, the light of truth. As Marcus Johnson returned to his car, the crowd cheered, their phones still raised high. They had not just witnessed a traffic stop. They had witnessed arrogance collapse under truth and dignity rise above prejudice. Officer Miller stood frozen by his cruiser, his face pale, his hands stiff at his sides. For the first time in years, he felt small in his own uniform. The badge on his chest no longer felt like authority. It felt like a reminder of his failure. Every whisper from the crowd, every recording phone pointed at him was another nail in the coffin of his pride. Marcus paused before getting into his car. He looked back at Miller one last time, his voice steady but softer now, almost like a closing statement. Remember tonight, officer. Remember the faces of the people here. Remember that respect is not earned by force but by fairness. If you cannot honor the badge will crush you. Miller swallowed hard, unable to answer. His throat felt dry, his chest heavy with shame. He knew these words would follow him for the rest of his life. Marcus stepped inside his car, closed the door, and started the engine. The smooth hum of the vehicle was almost too normal compared to the storm that had just passed. As he pulled away, the crowd erupted in applause again, their cheers chasing the car down the street. The officer remained standing in silence, watching the black car disappear into the night. He didn't chase it. He couldn't, because the man he had tried to control had instead controlled the entire story. The next morning, the world had already changed. Videos from the bystanders had spread across social media overnight. Dozens of angles showed Marcus Johnson's calm words, the officer's arrogance, and then the stunning reveal that the man in the car was the head of internal affairs. Hashtags exploded. A truth in uniform trended across platforms. Millions watched, shared, and commented. Some praised Marcus for his composure and wisdom. Others demanded action against Officer Miller. News outlets picked it up by noon. Anchors replayed the video, pausing at the moment when Marcus spoke the words. The badge does not shield you from accountability. It demands it. Those words struck like lightning, sparking conversations in living rooms, workplaces, and community halls across the city. For Miller, the fallout was immediate. Internal Affairs, the very department Marcus led, launched an investigation into his behavior. The recordings left no doubt. His tone, his aggression, his prejudice, it was all there, captured forever. By the end of the week, Miller was suspended pending a full review. His career, once built on pride, now hung by a threat of accountability. Some officers whispered among themselves, shaken. If someone as high as Marcus Johnson could be treated that way, what did it say about their own behavior? Others defended Miller, calling it a mistake. But the public had seen the truth, and the truth was not easily erased. Marcus, meanwhile, did not celebrate. He returned to his office quietly, continuing his work. To him, this was not about revenge or humiliation. It was about sending a message. In an interview requested by the press, Marcus spoke simply, "This is not about one officer. This is about a culture where judgment is made before questions are asked. A culture where prejudice is hidden behind procedure. We must do better. Not tomorrow, not someday, but today." The word spread just as widely as the video. For many, Marcus became a symbol of dignity under pressure, proof that calm truth could overcome arrogance. But for Officer Miller, the nights grew longer. He replayed the scene in his mind again and again, the flashing lights, the calm gaze, the words that cut deeper than any reprimand. Shame clung to him, a weight heavier than his uniform ever had been. He realized too late that the stop had not been about authority. It had been a test of character, and he had failed. Sometimes he thought about Marcus's warning. If you cannot honor the badge will crush you. Those words haunted him. Because they were no longer just a warning, they were his reality. For the city, the event became a story told again and again. In classrooms, teachers showed the video as an example of prejudice and accountability. In police academies, recruits were reminded that respect must be unconditional. In homes, parents told their children about the man who stayed calm in the face of arrogance and turned humiliation into truth. The story lived on. Not because of anger, but because of the lesson that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of justice. And so the night a racist officer stopped a black man became something greater. It became the night truth stood taller than pride. It became the night the city was forced to look at itself and decide to change.